The wind over the Laramie Plains carried a sound that the mountains had never known before, a long, echoing wail of iron on iron. It was not the cry of an elk, nor the rolling thunder of a high-country storm, but the scream of the iron horse carving its way westward. For 100 miles in every direction, the land still belonged to the antelope and the shadow of the old trappers. Yet here, in the heart of what had once been the domain of Bridger, Fitzpatrick, and Beckwourth, steel rails gleamed like a wound in the earth. Civilization had found its voice, and it sang in sparks and smoke. Medicine Bow Station sat lonely on the line, little more than a telegraph shack, a water tower, and a clapboard bunkhouse leaning into the wind. Beyond it stretched open sage and broken buttes, the kind of land a man could ride for days without seeing a fence or another soul. It was there that Elijah Hartman had settled, though settled was too strong a word for a man who'd never found comfort in walls. He had the look of the old breed, rawboned, long in the limb, the sun having carved its story into his face. His eyes, pale as glacier water, missed nothing. To the railmen who passed through, he was the operator, keeper of the wire and the code. But those who looked closer, the few who cared to, could see in him the ghost of another time. Years earlier, before the clang of hammers and the whistle of engines, Hartman had run with the mountain men. He'd traded beaver in the Green River country, run dispatches for Bridger's Post, and learned to read the wind like a printed page. He'd slept under a dozen roofs, but the only one he trusted was stitched from buffalo hide. He had seen the fur trade die, strangled by fashion and the march of progress, and he'd watched the wilderness shrink beneath the weight of rails. Now, in this half-built world of smoke and telegraph wire, he sat at a desk of pine boards, keying messages across the line that had once been his hunting trail. The telegraph clicked its language of dots and dashes, cold, mechanical, and precise. Yet somehow, to Elijah, it sounded like the drumming of hooves over distant prairie, an echo of all he'd lost. The air outside was thin and sharp. Winter came early in the high plains, rolling down from the Medicine Bow Range like a living thing. The rails were slick with frost, and every gust carried a whisper of the old wilderness, coyotes, cottonwoods, the faraway rush of the Platte. In moments like these, Elijah felt the land trying to speak again, as if the mountains themselves refused to be silenced by progress. He thought often of Jim Bridger, that half-wild oracle of the frontier, and of James Beckwourth, the mixed-blood legend who could outfight, outtrade, and outtalk any man from street. Louis de Santa Fe. Men like that had been kings of the high country, their maps drawn in memory, their courage their only compass. Now they were stories whispered over whiskey by railroad men who couldn't find the North Star if you nailed it above their bunkhouse door. Elijah didn't begrudge them the stories. The world needed its legends, and the mountain men had earned theirs. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the iron rails had stolen more than the wilderness. They had stolen the soul of a breed. By day, he worked the key, crisp, efficient, never missing a word. By night, he wrote in a small ledger he kept tucked beneath his bunk. It wasn't a diary, not exactly, but a record trails, rivers, the names of those gone west and never returned. The handwriting was careful, almost delicate, at odds with the rough hands that penned it. To anyone else, the notes were just lines of geography. To Elijah, they were memorials. Then the rumors began. At first they came like all frontier stories, whispered, uncertain, carried on the lips of drifters and half-drunk freight riders. A train held up near Julesburg. A payroll shipment vanished between Laramie and Green River. No one ever saw the robbers, but they struck fast and left nothing behind. Some said they were former scouts turned outlaw. Others claimed they were Indians or deserters from the army. But one night, when a freight conductor came through with his collar torn and a welt rising on his jaw, Elijah heard a detail that froze his blood. "They didn't talk like no bandits," the man muttered. "They used signals, whistle blasts, lantern flashes, like they'd planned every move by code." Code. Elijah stared at the telegraph key on his desk. Outlaws who used signals and timing, that was no wild guesswork. That was precision. That was a man's mind trained in the old ways, now turned against the new. The next morning, he sent a message up the line to Laramie. Unconfirmed reports of coordinated robberies, possibly ex-mountain men. Advise caution for payroll runs. The reply came hours later, cold and bureaucratic. Noted, Union Pacific. Security will investigate. But Elijah knew better than to wait on men from the cities. Civilization moved on timetables. The frontier did not. That night, as the wind tore across the plains, he stepped outside the shack and looked west. The stars burned sharp and merciless. Somewhere beyond those ridges, he knew, the old wilderness still breathed, and perhaps, in the heart of that darkness, men like him still roamed. Men who could read a track, smell a storm, and vanish into snow without leaving a print. He thought of the old rendezvous at Horse Creek, laughter, gunfire, the smell of tallow and whiskey. He remembered Beckwourth spinning tales by the fire, half boast, half prophecy. "Mark my words," Beckwourth had said once, "the wilderness don't die, it just changes its skin." Elijah wondered if that was what he was seeing now, the wilderness reborn in iron, with outlaws instead of trappers, telegraph codes instead of sign talk. Behind him, the wire hummed. A message tapped through from Cheyenne. "Expect payroll train eastbound midnight Saturday. Guard detail aboard." He sat back at the desk, watching the needle tremble with each dot and dash. Somewhere far down the line, another operator, another lonely soul between mountains and machines, would be reading the same message. But how many others might be listening? The code was supposed to be secure, but Elijah had seen enough of men to know that gold loosened tongues faster than whiskey. The station lamp flickered. He poured himself a tin cup of coffee gone cold and listened to the wind battering the walls. Outside, the horizon burned faintly orange, not sunrise, but the campfires of track layers, pushing the line farther west. He wondered how long it would take before the last wild ridge was scarred with rail. In the distance, a coyote cried. Elijah answered with a low whistle, an old habit, a call he'd used once to signal his partners on the green. The sound faded into the night. The wire clicked again, brief and cryptic. Traffic light between Cheyenne and Rawlins. Confirm receipt. He tapped a response, fingers steady, though his mind was far away, tracing trails no longer marked on any map. The iron horse had come, yes. But somewhere beneath the clamor of steam and progress, the old frontier still whispered. And Elijah Hartman, the last of the mountain men in a telegraph man's coat, was listening. Some said the age of the wilderness had ended. Elijah wasn't so sure. He'd lived long enough to know that the frontier never truly died, it just changed its code. And soon enough, that code would save a train. Or, damn it, the telegraph key spoke in a language few men could hear. Each click, each pause, each rhythm of brass and steel carried meaning sharp as a rifle crack, delicate as a whisper through pine needles. To the men who worked the line, the code was modern sorcery. To Elijah Hartman, it was simply another dialect of the frontier. He'd learned long ago that all wilderness had a tongue. The mountain talked through snowdrifts and the shifting of trees, rivers through current and ripple, tribes through hand signs and carved birch. A man survived by listening not with his ears, but with that deep animal sense that told him when to trust silence, when to draw his rifle, and when to pray. Now, the wilderness had changed its voice. The drumming hooves of buffalo were replaced by the pulse of the telegraph, that invisible heartbeat running west along wire and pole. But Elijah could still hear it. Beneath the mechanical chatter, he caught the same cadence that once guided him through fog and canyon. It was all pattern, the rhythm of life, trying to make sense of chaos. Every morning, he keyed out train schedules, freight reports, and weather bulletins for the Union Pacific. Every night, when the wire fell quiet, he practiced his own form of listening, replaying patterns in his head, tracing the pauses between clicks. It was in those silences that truth often hid. It was Larpenteur, years before on the Upper Missouri, who'd first taught him that a man could read another's intentions in the smallest signs, the way a horse breathed, the pause before a hand went to its knife. And it was from the Blackfeet, during that cold season near the Judith Basin, that Elijah had learned to speak in gesture, to read meaning where no words were offered. That old training came back now in strange form. For the first time, he began to notice the wire itself was speaking a little differently. One morning, just after dawn, as frost glazed the telegraph lines, a message from the east came through with odd rhythm. The content was plain, a freight manifest for the Cheyenne Division, but the spacing was wrong. The pauses between letters followed a peculiar count. 3 short, 1 long, 2 short. Elijah frowned. That pattern had meaning once, on another kind of frontier. It was the same order of calls trappers had used with mirror flashes and signal smoke. Danger moving west. He copied the message into his log, set it aside, and told himself it was coincidence. But 3 days later, another arrived routine on its surface, but again carrying that pulse, that old ghost code from the wilderness. He began to keep a separate notebook, one that no company man would ever see. Each time a strange message passed the line, he marked the rhythm beside it, then compared them after dark. Slowly, a picture began to form. These were no accidents. Someone out there was using the company's own telegraph system to send messages in disguise. The thought set his blood running cold. In the early days, when mountain men met danger on the trail, they relied on what they called the talk of the sign, small hidden marks on bark or stone, a twisted twig, a circle of ash. Those signs told who had passed, where danger lay, and whether a man was friend or foe. Elijah remembered one long winter with Bridger's company, when a misplaced sign had cost 3 lives. The lesson had never left him. Codes are sacred, misread one and you die. Now, someone was marking signs again, only this time the trail was made of copper wire and the stakes were heavier than pelts. He spent his evenings studying every relay point from Cheyenne to Rawlins, cross-checking messages. The pattern grew clearer. The coded transmissions always preceded payroll shipments, and always by less than 2 days. That meant planning men who knew not just the terrain, but the schedule of the Iron Horse itself. One evening, as a blizzard howled against the windows, a message clattered through. Train #47 expected delay due to snowdrift near Laramie. Hold orders until daylight. Ordinary enough. But there it was again, that same rhythm hidden in the keying. To the untrained ear, it was nothing. To Elijah, it shouted like a wolf in a trap line. The sender was signaling a delay, a perfect opportunity for a strike. He sat back, the lamplight painting deep lines across his face. The men behind this had to be old hands, scouts, or freighters who'd turned outlaw. Only those who'd lived by code could bend one so easily. The next morning he rode out along the rail, frost stinging his beard, eyes scanning the telegraph poles. Where the line dipped near the Medicine Bow River, he found what he expected, a splice, freshly twisted, bright copper glinting where the insulation had been peeled away. Someone had tapped the wire. He touched it lightly, feeling the faint hum of current. "You clever bastards," he muttered. The same cunning that once guided men through mountain passes was now guiding them to rob trains. The wilderness hadn't died, it had simply traded pelts for payrolls. Back at the station, Elijah keyed a private message to the next relay. Suspicious interference near Medicine Bow. Maintain secure code for priority traffic. Report irregular pacing. He paused before sending it. There was one more test he wanted to try. Switching to his own modified cipher, an old mixture of Blackfeet sign rhythm and Morse abbreviation, he added a short tail to the message. River breathes north before the storm. To most operators, it would look like garbled nonsense. But to anyone who'd ever run with the trappers, the phrase meant, "I see the sign. I know you're there." For hours, the line stayed silent. Then, just before dusk, a reply came from the west 4 dots, 1 dash, 2 dots. Not a word, but a reply in kind. Elijah's pulse quickened. Somewhere out there, maybe 50 miles down the track, someone had heard his signal and understood it. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled. The coffee in his tin cup long gone cold. The rail had become the new wilderness, the telegraph, the new trail. And once again, he was tracking something unseen, reading signs in the open, chasing shadows through code and distance. But there was one difference now. In the mountains. When you found the men who left the signs, you could see their faces. Out here on the wire, they were ghosts, invisible, swift, and deadly clever. He closed his notebook, listening as the night swallowed the wind. Somewhere beyond the darkness, a train was coming heavy with gold, guarded by men who didn't know what language death might be written in. And on the telegraph line between them, a silent conversation had begun. Elijah Hartman was the only man who could still hear it. The storm came out of the west like a living thing, sleet cutting sideways, wind screaming through the telegraph wires until they sang like bowstrings. The whole country seemed to tremble beneath it. Out on the line, the iron horse was still running. Black smoke whipped flat against the snow sky. Inside Medicine Bow Station, Elijah Hartman worked the key by lantern light, his fingers steady while the storm rattled every board around him. The wire was alive that night, messages coming thick one after another, engineers asking for clearance, station masters reporting delays. Somewhere between the rhythm of the storm and the staccato of the telegraph, Elijah caught something that didn't belong. A message from the West relay, simple enough: track clear, no obstructions. Proceed midnight eastbound. But the spacing was wrong again, too deliberate, too clean. It carried that strange heartbeat he'd come to recognize, the same pattern hidden in earlier transmissions. He jotted it down in his logbook and translated by instinct. It wasn't company code, it was a message between outlaws. He leaned back, the hair on his neck rising. "They're moving tonight," he murmured. The rails outside were glazed in ice, the world silent except for the wind. He thought of the men out there, whoever they were, tapping into the company's lifeline, twisting its own pulse against it. They'd learned to ride the telegraph the same way the old trappers read smoke. A new kind of wilderness and a new breed of predator. He sent a short burst east to Laramie. Possible tampering westbound near Sherman Hill. Watch line. Do not trust clear orders without verification. The response came 10 minutes later, faint through the storm static. Copy, Medicine Bow. Who else knows? No one, Elijah tapped back. Keep it that way. He set the key aside and listened. Out on the horizon, the whistle of the eastbound freight cried through the gale, long, mournful, echoing like the sound of something hunted. He stepped outside, his greatcoat pulled tight. Snow stung his face, the kind that crusted hard and burned the lungs. He could see the faint orange glow of the locomotive miles off, fighting its way up the grade toward Sherman Hill. "God help them if they don't stop," he muttered. Inside again, he turned down the lamp and stared at the telegraph table. The brass key glinted like a weapon. He could almost hear Larpenteur's words from years ago. It's the little signs that warn a man, the kind you only hear if you've learned the land's language. The wire clicked once, then again. A new message. Operator report position. Repeat, report position. The signature was from Fort Steele Relay, but Elijah knew better. The Fort Steele man was his friend, an old trapper named Noah Riley, and Noah's hand was fast, sloppy, and irregular like a drunk man's stride. This one was neat, mechanical. Someone else was keying under his name. They'd taken the Fort Steele office. Elijah's breath froze in his beard. He grabbed the rifle from its peg and checked the chamber of battered Springfield that had seen better days. Then he threw on his fur-lined gloves and mounted his bay horse, Whiskey, waiting outside the shack. The snow was knee-deep, but the horse knew the trail. They moved out toward the ridge where the line cut across open prairie, poles marching off into the storm. Elijah rode close beside them, counting each. 1. Watching for tampered wire. At the 15th post, he found it a splice, the insulation stripped again, the copper gleaming wet in the lantern light. He knelt beside it and felt the faint vibration of a live signal. Someone was still tapping the line close by. He cupped his hands to his mouth and gave a low whistle, 3 short, 1 long, the old mountain man distress call. The sound died in the storm. Then, from somewhere ahead, he caught the flicker of a lantern. Not the steady light of a station lamp, but a signal, 2 flashes. Pause, then 1. That was no accident. That was coordination. He doused his lantern and crouched low, creeping forward through the snow. The wind masked his steps. Ahead, near the cut bank by the tracks, he saw them 4 men huddled near the line, coats pulled high, horses tied close under cover. One worked the telegraph wire with a field key, the others watching the horizon. Elijah could see their breath steaming. They were organized too calm for green bandits. These were professionals. Mountain men turned modern. He listened to their talk as the wind shifted. "Train's behind schedule, storm's buying us time," one said. "When she hits the grade, we'll flag her. You two take the car. The operator won't know till it's done." Another laughed softly. "Operator's already deaf. We sent him to sleep at Fort Steele." A tight knot formed in Elijah's gut. Noah, they'd silenced him. The first outlaw tapped another short burst into the wire, confirming to a partner farther east. The sound carried just enough for Elijah to catch the rhythm. He memorized it. Then, as the wind roared, a new sound broke through, distant at first, then growing, thunder rolling up the track. The Midnight Express. The robbers froze, turning toward the glow cutting through the blizzard, the headlamp of the oncoming locomotive. Elijah had a choice: stay hidden and live, or act and maybe save the train. He rose from the snow and fired once into the air. The shot cracked like a whip, echoing off the ridge. The bandits turned, shouting, scattering for cover. Elijah fired again, hitting the lantern near their key. It burst in flame, spilling light over their faces, gaunt, bearded men, one with a scar from ear to chin. They bolted for their horses. Elijah swung up onto Whiskey and rode hard for the track, waving his arms and shouting as the train roared down the grade. Sparks flew from its wheels. The engineer saw him at the last moment, a dark figure in the snow, rifle raised, and hauled the whistle 3 long blasts. The danger call. The train screeched, slowed, then stopped barely 50 yards short of the ambush. The outlaws vanished into the storm, leaving their wire spliced and their plan ruined. When the smoke cleared, the crew found Elijah standing on the rails, snow up to his knees, rifle across his chest. The engineer climbed down, eyes wide. "Who in hell are to you?" Elijah looked past him, down the long gleaming line, then back at the storm. "Just a man who still listens to the wind," he said. He turned toward Medicine Bow, the telegraph wire humming faintly overhead. Somewhere out there, someone was still listening, and the conversation wasn't over. The iron horse would keep running. And Elijah Hartman, half ghost and half guardian, would stay on the line, waiting for the next sign written in code and storm. By dawn, the storm had passed. The plains stretched silent and silver, a frozen sea beneath a hard blue sky. The rails glittered with frost, and the telegraph line hummed faintly in the cold, the steady, living pulse of the new frontier. Elijah Hartman hadn't slept. He sat in the Medicine Bow office, his boots thawing by the stove, his fingers tracing patterns in the condensation on the window. The night before had proved what he already feared. The enemy wasn't some half-drunk gang of outlaws. It was men who knew, men who read signs, studied rhythm, and understood the wild logic of frontier survival. He'd spent enough years in the high country to recognize the pattern smart hunters never struck once and vanished. They tested the herd, watched its movement, and struck again when the timing was right. The robbery at Sherman Hill had been the test. The next one would be the kill. He poured black coffee into a tin mug and opened his small field notebook. Inside were coded scribbles, telegraph ticks, mixed with old trail symbols, a language of dots, dashes, and trapper signs. It was his own cipher, one he'd built from years of trading with the Crow and wintering under Bridger's command. Each mark told a story: wind direction, herd behavior, enemy motion. Now it would tell a new one how to hunt ghosts on the wire. He began reconstructing the messages he'd intercepted, laying them out across the desk like tracks in snow. The spacing told him where the outlaws had tapped the line. The timing told him how they moved. They weren't scattered opportunists. They were running a circuit, starting near Fort Steele, hitting the high grades, and always striking at night when the telegraph current was weak and the wind masked the sound of wire tapping. He could almost see them, faces half hidden beneath fur hats, hands blackened with grease, their gear packed tight like trappers on a winter trail. and he could feel it, the rhythm of their thinking. The way a hunter feels the mind of the animal he stalks. He remembered a winter long ago, deep in Blackfeet country, when an ambush party had trailed him for days through snow so thick it muffled the world. He'd survived not by running, but by reading the silence, knowing when the birds stopped calling, when the forest exhaled differently. The signs had saved his life then. They'd have to do it again now. By noon, the line from Fort Steele came alive. A message from the West operator: "Payroll train leaves Rawlins. Tonight, double guard aboard. Expected east by morning." Elijah stared at the note. The same bait as before. And the outlaws would be listening too. He set to work. With a steady hand, he keyed a message eastward, not in the company code, but in his own creation, a blend of telegraph and mountain sign. To anyone else, it would sound like meaningless chatter. But to a man trained on the frontier, it spoke clear as thunder. The herds change valley before sundown. Wait in shadow. It was beta signal crafted for the ears of men who thought like he did. If they were listening, they'd move to intercept what they believed was a redirected payroll route. But the train wouldn't be there. He'd already arranged a decoy run through Elk Mountain Pass, a rickety freight with nothing but lumber and salt pork. He spent the rest of the day riding north with Running Elk, a half-crow scout he'd known from his trapping days. The man rode light and silent, wrapped in a wolfskin cloak, his eyes sharp as obsidian. They spoke little. Words weren't needed between men who had tracked side by side through snow and death. As dusk fell, they reached the ridge above the old emigrant trail. From there they could see the faint glow of the tracks below and, beyond them, 3 flickers of light moving slow through the dark. Lanterns. "They took the bait," Elijah whispered. Running Elk nodded, his face unreadable. "They follow the noise of iron now, not the herd. Same hunger, different prey." Elijah smiled grimly. "Maybe, but the hunt's the same." They waited in the cold until the false train came chugging through the pass, wheels squealing against the frost. The bandits closed in silhouettes against the moonlit snow, rifles glinting faintly. Then the night split open with the roar of gunfire. Union Pacific Guards, hidden in the freight car, opened up with repeating rifles, their shots echoing off the canyon walls. The ambushers scattered, horses plunging into drifts. Within minutes it was over. 2 men were down, the rest vanished into the timber. Elijah and Running Elk rode down to the tracks, the acrid smell of gunpowder mixing with pine. The sergeant in charge saluted. "Your message saved us, operator. Don't rightly know how, but it did." Elijah nodded, glancing toward the woods where shadows melted into the trees. "It wasn't my message," he said softly. "It was theirs. I just learned how to read it first." The mountains loomed silent above them, black against the stars. The wire hummed faintly along the ridge, the voice of the new world whispering across the bones of the old. Elijah Hartman looked out toward that endless darkness where the ghosts of trappers, outlaws, and iron men alike drifted through time. He knew the war between wilderness and progress wasn't over. It had only changed its tools, rifles for rails, smoke for wire, trail signs for code, and as long as there were men who could still listen, the frontier would never truly die. The morning after the ambush broke cold and clear. A pale sun climbed over the Laramie Range, throwing long shadows across the frozen world. The air was brittle enough to crack, the kind of cold that burned a man's lungs and turned his beard white with frost before he'd saddled his horse. Elijah Hartman rode at a slow trot beside Running Elk, his crow companion, both men wrapped in furs stiff with frost. Behind them, a thin trail of steam rose from the halted freight car, the decoy train that had survived the night's trap. The guards were cleaning their rifles, their breath coming in plumes. It looked for a moment as though the world had paused between centuries. Old wilderness and new machine holding uneasy truce. "Fort Steele's not far," Elijah said, tightening his gloves. "We'll need to get word to the line captains before dark. Those outlaws will circle back." Running Elk nodded, his gaze fixed on the north horizon. "The spirits of these men," he said in his halting English. They are like winter wolves driven by hunger, not fear. Elijah gave a dry smile. You and I have both run with wolves, my friend. Let's hope they remember what happens when the elk turn hunter. They pressed on, the horses' hooves crunching through snow that had crusted overnight. The telegraph line ran beside them, its black poles standing like sentinels every few hundred yards. Each one hummed faintly as the wind swept across the wire like a stringed instrument stretched across the continent. That hum had become the sound of the age, the iron horse's heartbeat carried on copper veins. Elijah felt a strange kinship with it. The wire spoke to him, same as the wind once did in the mountain passes. Every click, every vibration carried a message if a man listened right. The old instincts were still there, honed in the wilderness, and merely given a new trail to follow. At midday, they stopped by a frozen creek to water the horses. Running Elk built a small fire with flint and tinder, coaxing life from the cold. As they ate jerky from Elijah's saddlebag, the Crow Man spoke quietly. "You trust these iron men too much," he said, nodding toward the distant rail. "They take what they want from the land. When the wind changes, they will take from each other." Elijah looked up, his face lined with weariness. "Maybe. But if I can stop a few men from dying by reading a code instead of drawing a gun, I'll take that trade." Running Elk's dark eyes studied him for a moment. Then he nodded. "Still a hunter," he said simply. They reached Fort Steele by late afternoon. The post stood hard and square against the wind, its log palisades rimed with frost, the flag frozen stiff above the yard. It was part military garrison, part rail depot men in blue, mixing with men in soot. Civilization, Elijah thought, never did come clean. The telegraph shack stood near the south gate, and, inside, it smelled of oil, ink, and cold metal. The operator's chair was empty. Noah Riley's seat. Elijah stared at it for a long moment. He found Riley's journal tucked in a drawer, pages soaked through with melted snow, but still legible. The last entry read, "Heard tapping on the line tonight. Not our signal. We'll investigate, come dawn." That was 3 days before Elijah found the wire splice near Medicine Bow. He closed the book and set it aside. "They killed him for listening," Elijah said softly. "A crime I might share if I'm not careful." That night, he wired a message east to Cheyenne headquarters, his fingers quick on the key. "Fort Steele operator deceased. Outlaws confirmed, organized, using relay intercept. Request authority to trace line personally. Response urgent." The reply came slow, hours later. "Authority granted. Be cautious. Keep dispatches secure." Rumors spreading, rumors. The word stung. The men in their offices saw this as inconvenience, not war, but Elijah knew better. The line was bleeding, same as a wounded animal, and the wolves had learned to follow the scent of gold. When he stepped outside, the sky had gone red with sunset, fading to violet over the plains. Running Elk stood at the gate, smoking his pipe, the ember glowing in the dark. "You found your answers?" he asked. "Enough to know the hunt's not over," Elijah said. "They've learned the language of the wire, but they haven't learned mine." Running, Elk smiled faintly. "Then we follow their trail. Like old days." Elijah nodded. "Like old days." They mounted up again, their breath rising like smoke, and turned west toward the dark horizon where the tracks disappeared into the mountains. The wind was sharp, the kind that cut through wool and skin alike, but Elijah felt something fierce and familiar stirring in his chest. The hunt was on again, not for beaver nor buffalo, but for men who had traded the long rifle for the telegraph key. And Elijah Hartman, the last of the trappers turned operator, rode into the gathering night with the same cold purpose he'd once carried into the high peaks: find the sign, read it true, and survive the telling. Above him, the wire sang in the wind, the new wilderness calling. And Elijah listened. The night was moonless, the kind of black that swallowed horizon and sky alike. Wind came down from the mountains, sharp as broken glass, driving fine snow into the drifts along the Union Pacific grade. From far off, a single red lantern bobbed through the dark, the signal light of the eastbound express crawling toward Sherman Hill, the highest point of the railroad between the Missouri and the Pacific. Elijah Hartman waited near the summit, his coat drawn tight, breath steaming through the cold. The telegraph wire hummed beside him, strung like a silver thread through the frozen world. Somewhere out in that darkness, the men he'd been tracking for weeks were moving to shadows. Among shadows, their rifles as silent as their intent. He'd followed their trail from Fort Steele, finding their signs like faint smoke in the snow. A spliced wire here, a burnt match head there, footprints that never went alone. Each discovery had built a picture in his mind, a band of 5 or 6 men, disciplined and deliberate, using stolen telegraph keys to map train schedules and payroll routes. Former scouts, maybe ex-freighters or soldiers. Mountain men fallen to the other side of the law. Now, at Sherman Hill, he was certain they would strike. The payroll from Cheyenne to Fort Bridger was due to pass through before dawn, 30,000 in gold coin, a prize big enough to risk everything. Beside him, Running Elk crouched low, his wolfskin hood pulled up, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "They will come from the wind's back," he whispered. "Always with the wind behind them, it hides the smell," Elijah nodded, "and it carries the sound of the train away. From them. That's smart." He tapped the frozen telegraph key on his portable field set, sending a short pulse eastward. Medicine Bow to Laramie, all clear at summit. Hold signal until further orders. He used the standard company code, but beneath it, hidden in rhythm, he wove his own pattern, the old trapper's cipher he'd adapted to the wire. Any outlaw still tapping the line would hear the message as routine, but the rhythm carried warning to those who knew his touch. Elijah had arranged for the engineer to be ready. One long whistle meant danger ahead. 2 shorts followed by 1 long meant halt at next sighting, armed escort waiting. It was crude but enough. Civilization, he'd learned, survived best when it borrowed from the wilderness. Hours passed. The wind eased, and the snow turned to fine ice that glittered faintly when the train's light finally pierced the dark. Its whistle wailed through the emptiness, the iron horse screaming its arrival into country that had never been tamed. Running Elk rose. "They come," he murmured. Elijah followed his gaze. To the south, faint silhouettes moved against the ridgeline, men on horseback, sliding down the slope toward the grade. They carried lanterns with hoods, letting just enough light leak through to signal each other. Elijah recognized the pattern immediately. 2 flashes, pause, 1 approach quiet. The same rhythm he'd seen in their coded telegraph bursts, the same mountain-born cunning turned against the steel age. He felt that old heat in his blood, the pulse of the hunt, the sense that the world had narrowed to breath, sound, and motion. "Stay low," he told Running Elk. "When the lead rider crosses the grade, take his horse. I'll draw the others." The first bandit reached the tracks, crouched, and began waving a lantern in short arcs, the false flag signal meant to stop the train. The engineer, still half a mile off, would see the moving light and assume a hazard on the line. Elijah moved before he could think. He lifted his rifle and fired into the air. The shot cracked across the summit, echoing off the bluffs. The bandit jerked his head up, startled, and shouted a warning. Horses reared. The lantern dropped and shattered, spilling fire across the snow. Running Elk was already in motion, a blur of fur and muscle. He tackled the nearest rider, dragging him from the saddle. The man's gun went off wild, the muzzle flash lighting his frost-bitten face. Elijah fired again, dropping another who'd swung his carbine toward the train. And then came the whistle, 1 long, piercing blast followed by the staccato chuff of brakes. The engineer had seen the signal. The express screamed to a stop just shy of the burning lantern. Elijah sprinted down the embankment, boots slipping on ice. Bullets tore through the night, 3, 4 shots, then silence broken only by the hiss of steam. He reached the locomotive, hammering on the steel door. "Guards!" he shouted. "They're in the cut! 2 arms!" Men spilled out with rifles and lanterns. The light fell across the snow, revealing 2 of the outlaws down and 1 crawling for his horse. Elijah aimed low, fired once, and the man slumped still. The rest vanished into the timber, swallowed by the night. For a long moment no one spoke. The engine hissed like some living beast, its heat steaming off into the cold. Finally, the conductor stepped forward, pale and shaking. "By God," he said, "you stopped them." Elijah lowered his rifle. "No," he said quietly, "I just read their sign." They spent the rest of the night clearing the tracks, guarding the train until dawn. When the first light crept over the ridge, the snow shone pink and gold. The dead were buried in shallow drifts beside the grade. Before leaving, Elijah climbed to the telegraph pole nearest the summit. He rested his hand on the humming wire, warm beneath the frost, alive with current. "You carry more than words," he whispered. "You carry the heartbeat of this land now. Best keep it steady." Running Elk joined him, silent as ever. The Crow Man looked down the long, gleaming rails that vanished into distance. "The buffalo once walked where the iron runs," he said. "Soon the iron will walk where men once prayed." Elijah nodded slowly. "Ain't that the truth?" He turned toward the east, where the sun was burning its way through the mist. The iron horse was already pulling out, its whistle echoing across the plains. He watched it go, that roaring emblem of a world reborn, and felt the ache of endings deep in his bones. For all its noise and fury, progress was just another kind of wilderness, and men like him were its last scouts. The old frontier had faded into memory, but tonight, under the frozen stars of Sherman Hill, Elijah Hartman had proved that the instincts of the mountain man still had a place in the age of steel. And though few would ever know his name, the wire would remember the rhythm of his code, the secret heartbeat that had stopped a train robbery in the dead of winter. When the snows finally broke and the rivers began to run again, the rails gleamed new beneath the thaw. The high plains smelled of sage and wet earth, and the mountains beyond stood like old gods watching a younger world awaken. The iron horse ran faster now, its whistle rising and falling like a hymn to progress. At Medicine Bow Station, the telegraph clicked steadily once more, the heartbeat of civilization pulsing through the veins of the wilderness. Elijah Hartman sat at his desk, sleeves rolled, pipe cold between his teeth. To any passer-by, he looked like any other operator, one of dozens scattered across the Union Pacific's spine. But to the men who rode the line, his name had begun to carry weight. They said he was the man who stopped the Sherman Hill robbery without ever firing a shot that mattered. They said he could read the wire like a man reads tracks in snow. Some even whispered that he'd learned his craft from the Crow, or that he'd once hunted with Bridger himself. Elijah never corrected them. He just worked the key, quiet as ever, letting the myths grow their own legs. The truth was simpler and lonelier. The old world he'd known was gone, and he was its last echo. Running Elk had gone north after the thaw, following the buffalo's ghost toward the Yellowstone country. The two men had parted with few words. "We hunted the storm," the Crow had said. "Now it hunts others. You stay with your wire. I go with the wind." Elijah had nodded. They both understood that some trails never crossed again. Since that night at Sherman Hill, the outlaws had vanished into history. A few rumors surfaced: a body found near Green River, a burned telegraph hut beyond Rawlins, but nothing that tied back to the men who'd tapped the line. The railroad pushed on westward, and the scars of the old fight were buried beneath progress. Yet every time the wire went silent for longer than it should, Elijah felt that same prickling on the back of his neck, as if ghosts still traveled its length, whispering through the current. He had seen enough of the world to know that legends didn't die. They simply changed their shape. One afternoon, a young operator rode in from Cheyenne, a boy with slicked hair and ink-stained fingers, eager to meet the man the foreman talked about. "You really stopped a robbery with code?" the boy asked, eyes bright. Elijah smiled faintly. "Not code, son, just listening." The boy frowned. "Listening to what?" "To what don't sound right," Elijah said, tapping the side of his head. "The wire talks. Same as the wind used to. You just have to know when it's lying." The boy nodded uncertainly, half understanding, then hurried off to tend the line. Elijah watched him go, feeling the tug of time like the pull of the current, through the copper. The next generation was coming fast, men who knew the click of the key better than the crack of a rifle. They'd make their own legends soon enough. That night, after the last train passed, Elijah stepped outside the shack. The stars were bright and fierce, crowding the sky like campfires over an endless prairie. He thought of all the miles he'd crossed from the Green River to the Great Divide, from trapping beaver to wiring telegrams. The tools had changed, but the fight was the same. Man against distance, against silence, against the dark. He took his old journal from his coat pocket, the same one he'd carried through the mountains, and wrote a single line beneath the last entry. The land still speaks. The words are just made of iron now. He closed it and slipped it back inside his coat. Some said later that he left Medicine Bow soon after. Some claimed he rode north to find running elk. Others believed he drifted south toward the old rendezvous, country, where a man could still vanish between mountains and memory. But every operator along the line knew one thing for certain. Now and then, when the wind rose over the plains, the telegraph wire would hum with a rhythm no one had heard before, 3 short clicks, 1 long, 2 short. They called it Hartman's signal. Old-timers swore it was just interference, the wind shaking the poles, the storm playing tricks with the current. But the veterans, the ones who'd run wire through snow and fire, said otherwise. "That's the mountain man talkin'," they'd tell the greenhorns. The last scout on the line, still riding the wire to keep the iron horse safe. And somewhere out there, beneath the stars, the hum would carry on, faint but steady, the voice of a man who had lived between 2 worlds and bridged them both. For the wilderness had not died when the rails came, nor had it vanished into myth. It had simply taken new form, whispering through steel, through code, through men who still knew how to listen. And as long as that rhythm traveled westward with the wind, the spirit of the mountain men rode with it unseen, unbroken, eternal,